Here. What do I enjoy? You. Oh, there was one I wanted to read from this. This one. This is a good one. Events are the real dialectic of history. They transcend all meaning, all personal judgments, all simple and irresponsible wishful thinking. Events, with the unbreakable logic of their development, teach the working and peasant masses who are conscious of their destiny these lessons. The class struggle reaches at a certain point a stage in which the proletariat no longer finds in bourgeois legality, that is, in the bourgeois state apparatus, the armed forces, the courts, the administration, etc., elementary guarantees in a defense of his basic right to life, liberty, personal dignity, and daily bread. He is forced to create his own legality, to create his own apparatus of resistance and defense. At certain moments in the life of the people, this becomes an absolute historical necessity and transcends every desire, every wish, every whim, every personal impulse. Events present themselves in a universal fatality with the engulfing rage of natural phenomena. Men, as individuals and as a mass, are brutally thrust into facing this dilemma: guaranteed probability of death or a slight chance of survival. A choice must be made, and men always choose the chance of survival, even if it's slight, and even if the survival in question is grueling and miserable. They fight for these slight chances, and their impetus is such, and their passion is so great, that it smashes every obstacle and it overwhelms even the most frightening apparatus of power. This is the situation that the real dialectic of history imposes on men at certain moments, the decisive moments of the painful and bloody development of humanity. No human will can create such situations. No mere man, even if he puffs up his chest and distills from literature the rhetoric that rouses hearts and boils blood, can create such situations. They are the blazing forge into which all the passions and hatreds flow, the likes of which only the vision of violent death can arouse in multitudes. Only such situations can be considered revolutionary in this period of history, as in the recent past with the exploits of the Spartacists in Germany and in Hungary, Ireland, and Bavaria. These situations offer no middle road. One must struggle and win. I don't know how much influence the Russian Revolution directly had on the Irish uprising, but obviously in this context, you understand what he's saying, that he's highlighting them as an oppressed people fighting against their oppressors in this time. Bavaria is a bit of an interesting one to highlight because Bavaria was a semi-independent section of Germany at the time. I guess autonomous would be a better way to put it. They had a socialist revolution and it got put down by the SPD, the Soc Dems of the time. It's a good detail for him to highlight here because the Spartacists in Germany were, a lot more of a leftist, more communist, I guess, in a lot of ways. They were not directly aligned in their methodology or ways they viewed things as they were with like Lenin. Like they were not Leninists, basically. They may subscribe to similar ideologies or aspects of ideology as Lenin, but it was different, right? Same with like Hungary. Ireland and Bavaria are both two examples that fit into the same sort of category, but ultimately what he's kind of pointing to is it doesn't matter the theory at the end of the day when it comes down to these struggles, right? All of these struggles are still resistance movements fighting against their oppressors. In this sort of position, the theoretical or the theory of it alone is not something you can really use to explain the actions themselves without also analyzing the history they're a part of, right? This is why he's saying events are the true dialectic of history, right? It's basically saying that if you're only relying simply on the theory, you're not truly engaging and understanding these things. You're just kind of a bit of a religious fanatic for your preferred ideology, right? I mean, yeah, you're just a nerd. It's like what Lenin said, right? You become insufferable as a communist if you're too dogmatic because your worldview is already determined and you're just following it like a religion. But he highlights all of these because they all vary different branches of socialism or resistance. But despite how in some of these spots there were ideological cohesion, right? Again, as you can see from this note here, one, Bavaria, a de facto part of Germany only after World War II, was the site of the proclamation of the Bavarian Soviet Republic in 1919, crushed by Frederick Ebert's Social Democrats and the Freikorps. So Social democrats are crushing revolutions. Petit bourgeois governments are crushing revolutions. If you view these things alone off actions, or you view them off of theory, each one fucks with your mind because there's no way you can rationalize it. If a socialist stops another socialist, right? If they are both from the same theory, then how do you understand a socialist group resisting another socialist group, despite them both agreeing for the necessity of socialism? And he also contrasts this with Hungary, which Hungary was a bit weird because a lot of Marxists from the USSR blame the trade unions in Hungary for a major contributor to why they failed, or that revolution failed, because it basically became like a clash of trade unions versus the government as a political workers movement. These situations offer no middle road. One must struggle and win. This is not our situation today. Today we can still choose with a certain degree of freedom. Freedom of choice imposes duties on us, serious duties regarding the life of the people, regarding the future of those who suffer and hope. There's only one way of expressing solidarity today: winning. This demands that not a single element be overlooked that could put us in a position to seize victory. In Italy today, there exists a party which serves the interests of the proletariat, and not only of the Italian proletariat, but of the entire Workers' International. Today, workers can and must have confidence. If Italian workers follow the discipline of the Communist Party without exception, they'll prove that they have transcended the stage of revolutionary infantilism in which their movement hitherto struggled, and they will prove that they are both capable and deserving of victory. Right? So this is in direct response to a lot of these failed revolutions. To put it in another way, when I say it is a little bit of religious thinking, I mean that in kind of a bit of a literal sense, that there are like fixed views of how things work, and there are fixed ways of interpreting it. I don't know the estimations of how religious the average person was 100 years ago to now, but understand that for a people that already separated themselves from religion as a specifically casting away the mechanical view of things, of like everything always works out, or everything must be done in this sort of way, or everything must be done in that way, and it must be treated as such based on this. It is basically appealing to people in the same way that you would speak to them like, why don't you just study the Bible and live by the Bible, versus like, what can we do for you? Which is why a lot of Marxist writers from this time period specifically reflect on dogma as a negative for this, right? Because if you're trying to speak to people's immediate needs, speaking to them like you're trying to hook them into like some sort of religion, they're going to view that in the same way that they view waiting for their right time in heaven. They'll get their due in heaven, that sort of thing, right? And I think Gramsci's criticism of relying too much on this is quite good, right? Yes, he's proposing emphasizing victory to acquire power and change the situation of the masses. Yes, he's saying that at the end of the day, no matter what theory or how you view things, if you organize and you work towards like a form of Marxist organizing and trying to establish socialist policies or a socialist government, if you rely only on what Marx wrote, you would be thinking, well, what's the point of starting a revolution now? There hasn't been a revolution in Germany yet. So why would I wait? Why would I do that? Why would I bother if I have to wait for Germany to have the revolution first? Like that sort of thinking. He's saying that you can go out, try to speak to people, try to organize with people, and you can establish your own reality, your own theory in that way by working off of what people need, what they want, and putting that to words, right? Because it does not matter what you think of like theories or interpretations of theories. It does not change that at the end of the day, Lenin, had a revolution. The Bolsheviks had a revolution. They created the USSR. Nobody can argue that. There's no way to indicate that as incorrect, right? You can criticize the theory the state is based on, but you cannot disprove or say that the USSR never happened. That's what he's kind of tying it to. Reality and like trying to influence reality by organizing yourself and actively trying to change things for the better. It's not gradualism, it's organizing, right? It's trying to build up and change your realities by building this organizational capacity and going from there. It's not to say that you should just not use theory, right? Explicitly, he says you should not be doing that, right? You should use theory to guide your understanding of the world and vocalize these things and try to organize around that. And if you're organizing around that, you're building like a community or like an organization of individuals who all just want to better workers' rights. You will be able to have a power position from that inherently by building people up and establishing all these things and doing these things, right? If you change things for them and you let them see and feel these changes, you are changing their reality. And this is how he describes organizing. I feel like it's also relevant to get this one real quick. The movement and the goal. And this is relevant because he's talking about the German Social Democrats, basically more of the orthodox slash anti-revisionist schools of thought for it, right? Is it possible for a movement to sustain itself without having a notion of its end goal? Bernstein's principle that the movement is everything, the final goal is nothing, though it claims to be an orthodox interpretation of dialectics, belies a purely mechanicist conception of movement, where human forces are regarded as passive and unconscious, as elements not unlike material things. He's pointing to how a lot of reformist social democrats would fixate more on like you would try to do things and change things in the immediate, but you would use that as justification for not going beyond or actually fighting for those things. Instead, the final goal is not directed anywhere. The movement is about how can I get what I want and put that in there and begin to keep doing that and repeating it, right? It's like, how do I go work within the system just without any sort of resistance beyond that? How do I work with that as a way of maintaining or gaining socialist or workers' rights, for example? This is interesting because Bernstein found his weapons in idealistic revisionism, and this should have led him to appraise the intervention of men in the historical unfolding as decisive. Let me check the notes. In the philosophical struggle between materialism and idealism, idealists tend to argue that the infinite potential of human willpower can disregard all obstacles and conditions in pursuit of its goal, whereas materialists tend to argue that conditions prefigure outcomes. Oh, it's just the explanation of the dynamic. I would describe it as idealists believe that you can, like, an idea can be so powerful that it would inspire a movement on its own. It could go beyond human limitations because the idea is so like inspiring or act provoking, I guess. Of course, this is where, like, if you understand like great man theory, you can make similar leaps in those same sort of, it is the rich piana. Leave humanity behind. Rich piana. Yeah, when they give a motivational speech in the movie and the whole world changes from that one speech, that is idealism, basically. If one looks more closely, however, one sees that in Bernstein, though human intervention is in fact valued implicitly, it's in a one-sided way, considered only as a thesis, but not as antithesis. The moment of resistance and perseverance, the thesis, is praised, but the initiative and progressive drive, the antithesis, is rejected. For Bernstein, there may be goals for resistance and perseverance, but not for progress and initiative. The consequence of this conception is passivity. Antithesis, which presupposes the awakening of still dormant and sleeping forces, needs goals, both immediate and mediated, for the sake of the movement. Without having a prospect of fulfilling concrete ends, movement cannot be sustained. The concept of the lesser evil, most relativizing, can be conceived as this kind of apologia. There's always a lesser evil than the previous lesser evil, a greater danger in comparison to the previous greater danger. Each greater evil becomes lesser in comparison with an even greater one, and so on indefinitely. This turns out to be nothing more than the form taken by the process of adaptation to a regressive movement, such that while reaction proceeds efficiently, the antithetical force is determined to capitulate progressively, in small stages and not all at once. If it were otherwise, the condensed psychological effect might give rise to an active competing force, or to a reinforcement of it if such a force already existed. Insofar as the regressive unfolding in the most advanced countries foreshadows what will happen in countries where the movement is in its infancy, comparison is in order. It remains to be seen how much is correct about the trend against individualism, and how much is erroneous and dangerous. The attitude of the two aspects of individualism, negative and positive, will necessarily be contradictory. The question, therefore, should be posed historically and not abstractly or schematically. The question takes a different form in countries that have had reform or that have been crippled by counter-reform. We can speak of a man collective in which conformism is imposed, or one in which it is voluntary. But should it be also called conformism in that case? Critical consciousness cannot arise without a break from Catholic or authoritarian conformism, and thus without a flourishing of individuality. Should the relationship between man and reality be direct or through a priestly caste, like the relationship between man and God and Catholicism, itself in turn a metaphor for the relationship between man and reality? This is like a good little dynamic and point of it. He's basically saying that if you don't understand a lot of this philosophy, your way of engaging with it is no different than having a priest parse the Bible and tell you what's in the Bible, basically, right? It is a very great kind of way of putting it, that you're not able to really directly digest things, but you need the priest to translate your reality for you, to translate what is actually happening. Struggle against individualism is really against a particular individualism with a particular social content, specifically against economic individualism at a time when it has become anachronistic and anti-historical. Remembering, of course, that it was historically necessary in a phase of the overall progressive unfolding. So he's basically saying that in the same way that he highlights Catholicism as remnants or like residue of how people interpreted the world or engaged with the world, in the same sort of way of having to shake off religious influence for cultural views, but also like how the church had like more authority in, you know, the medieval ages, right? I guess a better example would be more in like Italy, right? Because there is the papacy, right? There was a theocratic government there that was deeply intertwined with day-to-day living in Italy. And it's an extreme case because, you know, Italy and Russia are like two that had specifically huge state presence of the church over their histories, right? Like during the Middle Ages, the church was basically the power of Italy for a long time. And a lot of politicking back then ended up just kind of being like, how could I get my corrupt uncle as the pope, which has created a lot of interesting papal history, to say the least. But he highlights this and compares it to the economic model that capitalism represents, in that he highlights it as another step in this process towards better human development and the better future that can await humanity through the removal of inequality. It really can go in a lot of different ways, but since he's specifically indicating economics in this point, obviously he's talking about progressing the economic model to a more advanced, equal one, as opposed to the current capitalist structure that we're under, right? Again, doing it in a way that highlights it not as a negative, but as a historical process that has continued to move. Just that his issue with it is that it's stayed too long. That in the struggle to destroy an authoritarian conformity which has become retrogressive and cumbersome through a stage of development of individuality and critical personality, one arrives at the man collective, is a dialectical conception that is difficult for schematic and abstract mentalities to understand. Just as it is difficult for them to understand the argument that through the destruction of one state machine, we come to create another stronger and more complex one, etc. I love this one. It's so good at describing the current moment because this was kind of similar to the moment 100 years ago for what do they call it, the red years, 1919 to 1920 in Italy. Gramsci was very involved in the organization of workers in Turin, Italy. As a result, he got to not just see like where the average worker was at and what they wanted. It was also reflective of the Socialist Party at the time, who ended up being the most resistant to actually doing any sort of revolutionary striking. Like, I mean, literally, it was during strikes that their socialist trade unions essentially sold out the workers, right? So a lot of socialists at the time were trying to reconcile the fact that they were led to believe that the average socialist was going to advocate for better rights and better workers' rights, but they ended up just functionally being another liberal, another like Christian Democrat at that time. And that is where fascism actually springs out of it, especially because Mussolini had a bit of a reputation as a socialist before that was alienated by the socialists in the mid 1910s. it was, for a lot of people, a kind of natural conclusion, I guess. Yeah, like it played heavily on that resentment. Extremely so. So that's why, like, it sounds like he's just talking about today, especially the part about lesser evil voting, right? The concept of the lesser evil, most relativizing, can be conceived as this kind of apologia. There's always a lesser evil than the previous lesser evil, a greater danger in comparison to the previous greater danger. Each greater evil becomes lesser in comparison with an even greater one, and so on indefinitely. If you're just advocating against who they are, then at the end of the day, you're not really worth anything or doing anything. The movement is empty. There is no movement. There's nothing there that you can get out of it. If at the end of the day, you're just pointing to what could be if someone else is in that position, it's less about what you offer and more about what the other person offers. So what happens then if you have a figure who uses similar wording or similar speech patterns, or like plays off that same sort of resentment? You can get people who would identify as a socialist, but they end up gravitating towards more reactionary politics out of it. It's not just about the direct policies of it, but also like the ramifications and what that means for the movement itself, for the goal of attaining socialism, right? And I think especially this part, it hits very hard today, doesn't it? This turns out to be nothing more than the form taken by the process of adaptation to a regressive movement, such that while reaction proceeds efficiently, the antithetical force is determined to capitulate progressively, in small stages and not all at once. If it were otherwise, the condensed psychological effect might give rise to an active competing force, or to a reinforcement of it if such a force already existed. When people are guided primarily by lesser evil voting, they're not guided by principles, they're guided by fear. And if you expose them to this fear over and over again, especially if one, there's no resistance after the fact, and it's like, if your whole policy is this guy's evil and we need to stop him from getting into power, but at the same time, you're not doing anything. There's no meaning out of if you get elected. When you getting elected is just saying, this is status quo for another 4 years. There will be silent progress that goes on behind the scenes, and you can expect progress, but that's just how it is. When people get exposed to these situations enough, it does not create trust in any political party. In fact, it may produce spite or resentment towards the party for building in this way and then showing no backbone, showing no resistance, show no interest. It shows that there are no principles. And if there are no principles, then at the end of the day, there is no movement. This is something that I think Gramsci understood very well for the time. And I think this bit is noteworthy too. Insofar as the regressive unfolding in the most advanced countries foreshadows what will happen in countries where the movement is in its infancy, right? I'll give you an example of modern day with like Trump. Trump as a figure validates a lot of external sloganeering like this, I guess you could say, like pointing only to like political promises and nothing else, because it is a lesser evil dynamic that also extends beyond just the region you are also in. Now, because there's a lot more, everyone is connected, you have the internet, you have all this shit, the telephone, the TV, the television, all that stuff also means you can politically posture against people in this same exact way without committing to anything else. It's just kind of like it's a breather, it's a refresh a little bit. Whereas the most regressive or reactionary forces can just point to the more reactionary force and say, I see this is bad. We know it's bad. We can connect here on this, right? Even in that, it is a kicking of the can down the road for a lot of these other countries doing these same tactics, right? Because at the end of the day, they are doing the same thing. They are just further away from it, right? They can simply just say the things, and that'll be viewed as a level of resistance or reaction that is appropriate or corresponds or resonates with the average person or the masses in that way. Again, like this is like a great example of like Carney, right? Carney literally does a speech. He drops a Gramsci quote. What do you think he does after that? He builds oil pipelines and he integrates ice and supplies them out of it. So on one hand, he's like, I recognize all the evil of the age of monsters. But at the same time, he's funding and supplying the monsters. There is obviously a level of realpolitik you kind of have to look at these things for. But you should understand it's not about the political substance underneath that necessarily matters as much as it's about how people weaponize this lesser evil or this greater danger kind of thinking, right? That's the idea of it. This is why I love him. He's good. It is a very good way of describing the problems. What is noteworthy for Gramsci for the period, and like this is not an exaggeration, and it may seem insane today to say this, or it may seem insane to think this way, but a lot of Marxists from his time period, like the late 1910s to mid 1920s, they did not really take fascism that seriously. They just kind of viewed fascism as like another conservative sort of ideology that ultimately just kind of would burn out as it was another bourgeois invention. They basically just viewed fascists as unreliable and that fascists would inevitably implode underneath themselves. And it would happen in a way that it would just inevitably bring everyone back to socialists. So when these fascists begin to imprison all the Communist Party leaders, and like 2 years before Gramsci is jailed, they kill a major minister. It would be like a democratic socialist, this guy. Matteotti was a follower of Filippo Turati. He was, again, more on the right than a lot of communists. On June 1st, 1924, the police chief Emilio De Bono ordered Otto Thierschadel, the spotter of the assassination squad, who is unanimously considered by investigators and historians to be a timeless liar who lived by his wits. This is a real Wikipedia sentence. To be released from prison with a telegram signed for the Minister of the Interior at that time. The Minister of the Interior ad interim was Mussolini. On June 10th, at around 4 p.m., Matteotti was bundled into a black Lancia, more specifically the Lancia Lambda limousine model, by 5 men while he was walking to Parliament for work. They are Domini, Albino Volpi, Giuseppe Viola, and Leto Povermo, and Augusto Malacria, all acting as members of Mussolini's secret political police. Matteotti had left his house and was heading towards the Chamber of Deputies to prepare his speech on the authorization of the provisional exercise of the state budget. When Matteotti reached the Lungotevere, he came across the Blanclaquia parked with some people on board. Waiting for him was the fascist squad of Domini, who kidnapped Matteotti, loaded him into the car, and then stabbed him during the beating that took place in the car. Inside the car, Matteotti was stabbed several times with a carpenter's file as he struggled to escape. His corpse was found after an extensive search near Driano, 23 kilometers north of Rome, on August 16, 1924. He was 39, and the discovery of Matteotti's body was accidental as it was sniffed by the dog of a carabinieri sergeant on leave near the countryside of Riano. As 2 months had passed since his disappearance, the body was already decomposing, so a dental examination was necessary to identify him. Matteotti was the latest victim of fascism following the 1921 murders of Spartaco Lavagini, a communist trade unionist, and Giuseppe Di Vagno, a PSI deputy from Apulia, and the 1923 murder of a priest, Giovanni Minzoni. Although Matteotti was not the first nor the last victim of fascism, his murder was particularly notable due to occurring not long after his speech to Parliament and in broad daylight, and was a watershed in Italy, in fascist Italy, due to the Mussolini government issuing the Fascistissime laws in 1926 that fully established an authoritarian dictatorship. By 1938, Mussolini had exiled, jailed, or killed the various major opposition leaders, including Christian Democrats like Luigi Sturzo and future Italian Prime Minister De Gasperi, jailed, liberals like Piero Gobetti and Giovanni Amendola died as a result of fascist squad attacks, and communists like Amadeo Bordiga, exiled, and Antonio Gramsci died in prison. So you can see they killed this motherfucker while he was in Senate. Let's just say the theory that they would abide by bourgeois democratic mandates to preserve bourgeois capitalism it was a little different quite early. Let's just say that. In the afternoon, Mussolini made a statement to the Chamber of Deputies, generating protests from the parliamentary opposition. Also on June 10th, the first arrests began and continued in the following days. On June 27th, the opposition commemorated Matteotti's death, officially starting the Aventine secession, and throughout Italy, many workers abstained from work for about 10 minutes. Basically like I guess like a moment of silence kind of thing, you know? This happened a lot. They already highlight in this description that there had already been quite a few of them. Sorry, I just realized. Did they put a red dot where this guy got kidnapped at? It feels like a YouTube thumbnail, honestly. It just needs like a speech bubble above it. He was here? Basically, all of this is to say the threat of fascism had already shown a lot more direct brutality against opposition quite early. And this is not any different, because if you're familiar with some of the things that also Gramsci has written, I guess we could check the 1919 general election, right? No, we want the 1921. This is what I was talking about, the red years, right? The 2 red years was a 2-year period between 1919 and 1920 of intense social conflict in Italy following the First World War. The revolutionary period was followed by the violent reaction of the fascist black shirts militia and eventually by the March on Rome by Mussolini in 1922. The important thing to note is actually the resistance. By 1921, the movement was declining due to an industrial crisis that resulted in massive layoffs and wage cuts. I would not say this. They fired all the workers that struck against them. It was not that they just decided to fire all these workers because of wage cuts or layoffs. They basically made an agreement with the trade union that they would, in exchange for their demands and to stop striking, they could not be fired for their strikes. They agreed to that, and then the factories all fired them anyways. Like a majority of them were fired before they even went back to work. In contrast to the passive demeanor of the PSI and CGL, the Socialist Party of Italy and the Congress of Trade Unions, basically, employers and the fascists did react. The revolutionary period was followed by the violent reaction of the fascist black shirts militia, with the support of Italian industrialists and landowners, and eventually by the March on Rome by Benito Mussolini in 1922. Fascist austerity imposed from 1922 to 1928 resulted in workers' gross wage share tumbling back to 1913 levels by 1929. So that's when they began to strike in the first place, for what it's worth. Reversing the gains made during 1919 to 1920, when, according to political economist Clara Mattei, average Italian nominal daily industrial wages quintupled, around a 400% increase, compared to their pre-war levels by 1921. A 1924 article published in the Times lauded the imposition of austerity. I need to read this. Is this it? Fuck, I need to read this article. The development of the last 2 years has seen the absorption of a greater proportion of profits by capital, and this, by stimulating business enterprise, has most certainly been advantageous for the country as a whole. A quantitative sociology study of the period by analyzing newspaper news in the period clearly demonstrates the evolution of violence acts between the social groups involved. And those social groups, let's just say, violence grew in 1921 when the Royal Italian Army began to assist the fascists with their violence against communists and socialists. With the fascist movement growing, anti-fascists of various political allegiances, but generally of the international left, combined into the Arditi del Popolo, People's Militia, in 1921. In 1922, with the threat of a general strike being initiated by anarchists, communists, and socialists, the fascists launched a coup against the second Facta government with the March on Rome, which pressured Prime Minister Luigi Facta to resign and allowed Mussolini to be appointed Prime Minister of Italy. 2 months after Mussolini took over as prime minister, fascists attacked and killed members of the local labor movement in Turin in what became known as the 1922 Turin Massacre. Are you noticing a trend? Are you noticing a trend here? It's a lot more linear than you may think for a lot of this time period. Look at who it is again. The residual working class opposition was shown by the ongoing clandestine production and distribution of the Turin-based communist newspaper El Ordine Nuovo, headed by Antonio Gramsci, as well as political factory and parliamentary organization, including popular uprisings against fascist encroachment on working class neighborhoods and an important factory election victory. Basically, throughout the early 1920s, after Mussolini gets into power and the black shirts are like really fucking things up, check this one out. They were held 2 years after the March on Rome, in which Benito Mussolini's fascist party rose to power, and under the controversial Acerbo law, which stated that the party with the largest share of the votes would automatically receive 2/3 of the Senate in Parliament as long as they received over 25% of the vote. Mussolini's National List, an alliance of fascist and a few liberal political parties, used intimidation tactics against voters, resulting in a landslide victory and a subsequent 2/3 majority. This was the last multi-party election until 1946. Yes, literally. Zerzash is not even being hyperbolic. It's true. They literally beat up people who looked like they were going to vote against them, whatever that means. I'll let you decide what that means. On December 31st, 1924, black shirt leaders met with Mussolini and gave him an ultimatum: crush the opposition or they would do so without him. Fearing a revolt by his own militants, he decided to drop all trappings of democracy. On January 3rd, 1925, Mussolini made a truculent speech before the Chamber of Deputies in which he took responsibility for basically fascist militia violence, but did not mention the assassination of Matteotti, which again, I want to remind you, this happened in June of 1924, but they only found out in August, in the middle of August. This speech is usually taken as the beginning of the fascist dictatorship because it was followed by several laws restricting or canceling common democratic liberties, all rubber stamped by a fascist-controlled parliament. What's very important to remember about this is, even though he was prime minister, he played with the idea of it being a democracy, right? And yet, all this time, he had fascist, like, militia groups beating people up and fucking them up all over and killing people. And he was just like, well, they're not my guys. Until all of a sudden, yes, in fact, they are his guys. Whoa, he got 60% of the vote. I wonder how that happened. This is right before Bordiga is jailed, I think. After Mussolini consolidates his power, I'm pretty sure he jails Bordiga. Oh, maybe not. But I do know Gramsci and Bordiga make up, because in some of Gramsci's letters, he talks about making a prison school with Bordiga, and Bordiga teaches them like science, and Gramsci teaches the prisoners history. It's kind of cute.